right. We're going to get started. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming on this lovely fall day. It is truly my pleasure to introduce the Francis Biddle Memorial Lecture and to welcome Emily Bazelon, the Truman Capote Fellow for Creative Writing and Law at Yale Law School and a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. As you all know, Emily is an author of best-selling books, a podcast host, and a deservedly decorated journalist. Through a rare combination of extraordinary analytic acumen and felicity of expression, she is able to bridge the often daunting gap between discourse inside and outside the legal academy. Throughout her career, she has tirelessly investigated and illuminated vital questions of civil rights, criminal justice, and many other salient topics that are really central to our republic. So please join me in welcoming Emily. In a moment, I'll turn things over to my colleague, Professor Charles, who will say a bit more about our distinguished speaker. But before I do, let me say a few words about the Biddle Lecture and its namesake. Francis B. Biddle was a 1911 graduate of this fine law school. After beginning his career as a law clerk to Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., he went on to serve as Solicitor General of the United States and later Attorney General. He also represented the U.S. as a member of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. The Biddle Lectures began with a gift from his widow, Catherine, who asked that the selection of our lectures reflect, quote, that civil liberties and civil rights were of particular concern to my husband and thus particularly appropriate areas for lectures. Well, I think we have done right by the Biddles today. Okay. Lastly, it is truly my pleasure to introduce Professor Guy Charles, the Charles J. Ogletree Jr. Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. Professor Charles, as you all know, is a groundbreaking scholar whose work compels us to revisit and reimagine voting rights, race, and democracy in America. Among many other achievements and accolades, he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Law Institute. Since joining this faculty in 2021, he has become a mainstay, lending his time and talent to teaching and mentoring our students, to running the Houston Institute, and more generally to ensuring that we remain true to our core mission of teaching, scholarship, and service. And with that, I hand things over to Professor Charles.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Dean Goldberg. We are truly fortunate to have you as our fearless leader, smart, thoughtful, tall, which I resent, but otherwise so grateful for you and your presence. Emily, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Harvard Law School. So many of us have read your award-winning books, listened to your podcasts, and read your work in the New York Times Magazine. In some respects, this first question, and to be in conversation with you, this first question may be irrelevant for some, but I'd still would like for you, in your own words, to tell us a little bit about your career, how you came to this place, the journey from Yale Law School, Yale undergrad, Yale Law School to where you are today.
Sure. First, I just want to say thank you to Dean Goldberg, to Professor Charles for inviting me, and to all of you for coming and giving some of your time, which is one of our most precious commodities, especially as the semester progresses. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you. Sure. So I worked as a journalist, mostly at a small newspaper in California after I graduated from college, called the Tri-Valley Herald, which doesn't exist anymore, which is fine. Mm-hmm. That it was a really good place for me to make mistakes quietly before the internet completely existed. And I learned a lot. It was not a great newspaper. And I felt a little stuck there. 3 years out of college. And so I applied to law school, not with a super coherent plan, to be honest, but thinking that I somehow maybe would figure out how to make my way into national magazine journalism, into long form. We didn't have that word, but that was what I wanted to do. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll get there and I'll love it and I'll practice law. There's lots of law in my family. And when I went to Yale, it was very fortuitous. Link Kaplan, who had been a staff writer at The New Yorker for a long time, was on the faculty, and he actually had come to start a small magazine. So I kind of eagerly appeared in his office and asked to be his research assistant. And then over the course of law school, realized that I really didn't want to be a lawyer. I have lots of respect and admiration for lawyers, but it just wasn't my thing. And I went back into journalism after clerking by going to work for Link and starting a magazine called Legal Affairs, which sadly doesn't exist anymore, and launched a set of kind of amazing people because Link was such an incredible mentor. And from there, I went to Slate for a number of years, where I found having some sense of how to ask questions, a base of knowledge, people to call, was really useful. I like that when I write about legal issues, there's a kind of, as you know, a structure and a framework. It's not just all about my preferences. And I also found it really useful for my own confidence, that I felt like I was building off of something where I had gone to school. And then from Slate, I did start doing a lot of long-form writing, mostly for the Times Magazine, for years as a freelancer. And then 10 years, I came on staff and joined the magazine full-time. Just mostly just an amazing privilege, and sometimes kind of terrifying because it's a big platform. And people read what we have to say very closely, which is good. But also means sometimes that I feel like I'm trying to dance on a tightrope. And I'm lucky the magazine has incredible editors and fact checkers who are supporting our work.
So you're here to talk to us about the Justice Department and where we find ourselves in this moment. And we'll be looking to you for wisdom on that. But first, if you can situate us and give us a sense of the history of the Justice Department, why it's important, and also then why do we and how we find ourselves in what seems to be a crisis at the Justice Department in this moment. If we could explain a little bit of that.
Yeah, sure. So the Justice Department does not go back to the founding of the country. It really began, oh, my mic's not on apparently. Although my voice is so loud that it doesn't matter that much. It's on, it looks like it's on. Oh, there it goes. Okay, maybe it's just that it's not up. All right. Oh, there you go. All right. Is that better? Okay, sorry about that. So the Justice Department was founded in 1870. And the good romantic story about its founding was that the federal government, President Ulysses S. Grant, and Congress was trying to enforce the rules of Reconstruction. And they did do some of that, but there's also another narrative that the Justice Department, by consolidating the legal aspects of the federal government, was a way of saving money, and that actually lots of lawyers who worked in other parts of the government wound up losing their jobs, and there was a kind of winnowing going on. So that's like the less romantic part. It really becomes a major institution of American government during the New Deal in the 1930s, when the federal government as a whole becomes more robust, and the Justice Department is trying to help FDR make the New Deal happen. And then in the 60s, starting with the Kennedy administration, it becomes an enforcer of civil rights. And this is a really important kind of storied part of the history of the Justice Department, where you have someone like John Doerr, a young lawyer at the time, really getting invested in desegregation and collecting the kind of evidence with FBI agents going into the Deep South that helped lead to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And I don't want to press too hard on this because obviously this is fairly late in our nation's history for us to be addressing these problems of racial discrimination. But at that moment, which is when the Civil Rights Division is born in the Justice Department, that's an important part of its history. And so it's a huge, sprawling agency. It employs more than 100,000 people now all over the country. The FBI, the Drug Enforcement Agency, are under the auspices of justice. So it has its whole own policing investigative arm, employing lots of people. There are 93 U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, maybe 94. That's like there's 2 in one place anyway. And then Main Justice in Washington has all these different subject matter divisions that have expertise that they bring both to prosecutions themselves and legal enforcement, but also to supporting the U.S. attorneys' offices. And there's a lot of making of legal policy in the Justice Department through the Solicitor General's office, the Office of Federal Programs that defend federal laws and federal actions in court. And then the Office of Legal Counsel, which traditionally, at least, has been very important for deciding the legality of the president's actions, in particular executive orders, though it is very much sidelined in the current administration. So it feels a little dated to talk about that role right now.
Help us understand where we are in this moment, and perhaps for some, a sense of crisis, especially at the DOJ. What does that mean? What does that look like? Concretely, give us a sense of what is happening.
Yeah, I think crisis is a completely justified word to use, and I think to a lot of degree it is an actual bipartisan sense of crisis. And what I mean by that is that if you have worked in the Justice Department in the past, since Watergate, which is basically most people who have worked in the Justice Department at this point, what's happening now is just an utter dismantling of all the norms and rules that were enacted after Watergate to try to have some distance, some separation between the White House and its political aspirations and the Justice Department and what it does. Now, that separation was never complete because the White House, the president, sets policy for all of the federal agencies, including the Justice Department. And so Watergate, since then, if the president has a new priority, I want to do more policing against gangs or more corruption prosecutions or more immigration enforcement, that is something the Justice Department has always responded to. But what has been sacrosanct until now is the idea that the priorities of the White House will drive decisions about individual criminal and civil investigations and really change how the nation's laws are enforced, even though the statutes themselves have not changed. And that is something that the Trump White House deliberately and publicly and with public justification has really decided those rules just don't apply anymore. Now, the department still has its own Bible. It's called the Justice Manual. And the administration has not changed the provisions that call for separating political influence from these decisions. But President Trump often very publicly, as probably all or most of you know, has been going about trammeling those rules. And what he says, and he's right, is that he is the nation's chief law enforcement officer. The problem is that we have, since Watergate, relied on the president, and the president has previously taken a lot of, pride is the wrong word, but presidents have been very careful for their own political benefit to separate themselves and to kind of respect these norms and rules that have governed this sort of distancing. And President Trump just sees it really differently. And not entirely, but for the most part, he's pretty much allowed to do that, at least until the courts stop him. And that, as probably many of you know, just hasn't happened yet. So that, I think, is this sense of crisis. And it's outside the building from judges, from people who used to work at the Justice Department, from lots of people who care about the rule of law. And then inside the agency, it goes very deep. More than 4,000 people have resigned. More than 250 have been fired. And in Main Justice, parts of that building, that apparatus have really been decimated. 70% of the Civil Rights Division has either resigned or been fired, for example. And then there are certain U.S. attorneys' offices across the country where there's a huge sense of crisis, and it has to do with these politically driven prosecutions. The Eastern and Western districts of Virginia are 2 examples.
I'm going to ask you to talk in a moment about the prosecutions. And I'm sure we're going to have time for the students to ask questions, so I'm sure there'll be questions on those. But before we go there, you helped conduct a survey of, 50 or how many legal professionals prior to the second Trump administration. Curious why, what were you anticipating? What were the questions that you wanted answered? And what did you learn from that process?
Yeah, so this is a year ago last summer, so 14 or 15 months ago. As you all know, we were in the middle of this campaign season, and there was a lot of beginning to be kind of ripples of concern based on really the end of the first Trump administration and actions President Trump took to influence the conduct of the Justice Department. Well, if he gets reelected, what's this likely to mean? And obviously, that's a hypothetical question, but we had the idea, well, what if we ask the people who used to run the Justice Department? So we worked really hard to get a group that was evenly split between Republican and Democratic appointees. And it was people who went all the way back to the Reagan administration. By all means, a kind of self-selected group in the sense that we reached out to really hundreds of people all over the country, but who decided to answer the survey and talk to us was something we didn't really have any control over. Some people were very high up. It was, former attorneys general, former solicitors general. And then there were people who had been US attorneys. There were retired judges in this pool, though it was mostly Justice Department people with a few retired judges and a few people who'd worked for the White House counsel's office. And we just want to know basically, what kind of impact do you think a second Trump administration could have on the rule of law based on the things Trump was saying at the time on the campaign trail and based on his record during his first term? And we heard a fairly high level of alarm about use of the Justice Department that would break the rules, preventing political influence. But as you can imagine, there were a bunch of dissenters. Some of them had worked for Trump in his first term, but others of them had not. And there was a lot of sense that maybe we were kind of exaggerating, some pushback that the questions themselves were unfair. We had some questions that we were careful to include about the Biden administration's decisions through special counsel Jack Smith to prosecute, to charge President Trump. But it was true that the survey was not the same questions about a President Harris. And we thought that was justified, again, by Trump 1 and the questions under the statements that President Trump was making at the time. But we were also aware that just asking this, just sort of setting this up, was a kind of risk to take. And we thought a lot about that framing and decided to include some of the pushback and opposition to the questions in the piece. So if you go back and read this piece, which ran a year ago, like the beginning of October 24, you'll see a kind of careful inclusion of, I don't like these questions, why are you asking me this? But also some sense that most people, including most of the former Republican appointees, were quite concerned about what was going to happen.
So can I ask, one response then is, look, the politicization of the DOJ is really something that started under Obama, continued with Biden, and not a Trump thing. And so really, from that perspective, it's unfair to paint it in that way, or at least to ask those questions. First, what do you think about the premise? And then how do you respond to the premise?
Well, I think the premise is really important to think through. One thing I try really hard to do working generally, but especially on this, is to kind of set aside my own politics and think like, when people are making this claim, what's it about? Where does it come from? And then also, how did things actually play out? So, the facts are that there were reports that the Obama administration, FBI, and Justice Department felt were serious enough about the potential for Russian influence on the outcome of the election in 2020 that they had to open an investigation. In fact, actually, this is going back to 2016. Sorry, I'm always getting this mixed up because it just feels so long ago. So this is the very end of the Obama administration. They opened an investigation. Eventually, that leads into Robert Mueller's special counsel report and the impeachment hearings. And so that's one set of facts and questions. It's really the tail end of the Obama administration. And then I think more pressing are the decisions the Biden administration made to charge President Trump criminally. And so I see the kind of retaliatory tit-for-tat narrative.
I think it's really a very different set of circumstances than we have now. And that just basically has to do with the facts on the ground. And my own sense that the Biden Justice Department really kind of got dragged or dragged itself into these prosecutions. They were very delayed and really only got going after Congress, through the January 6th committee, had created a really big factual record that was kind of glaring. And so at the time, and I still feel this way, there was a choice between sort of ignoring significant evidence of law breaking by President Trump, both having to do with the document, the obstruction, not returning all the classified documents that were in the bathrooms and wherever else at Mar-a-Lago, and then this question of the role that Trump had played at the January 6th riots at the Capitol and what influence he had then. So they had all of this on the record, and then they had to, once Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, appointed Jack Smith, you have to ask prosecutors to kind of ignore all of this, when to them it seems clear that they have a factual predicate for bringing charges. I still think that you can make an argument that they could have ignored it, that they could have decided that based on the kind of health of the nation and the problems with prosecuting former leaders, which some countries have done successfully around the world, but a lot of countries have really stumbled over, that it just like wasn't a good idea, right? Prosecutors have a lot of discretion. So that's one set of facts, and obviously people have strong feelings on both sides. I really can see both sides of this. I think there's another question which I have like a stronger sense of now, which is about timing. By the time those charges were brought in federal court, the clock was really running on the Biden administration. Now, there are things that happened, especially with the Florida case in Judge Cannon's courtroom, that I'm not sure that Jack Smith could have anticipated. And I put this on him because I do believe that Attorney General Garland really tried to separate himself and the Biden administration from Smith's decision-making. We don't have any evidence to the contrary, and certainly we don't have evidence that President Biden was directing any of this. So there was some maybe bad luck, but there were also just a big set of questions about whether they were ever going to finish this prosecution by the time the 2024 election rolled around. And even if Trump had not been reelected, the idea that you could really separate law and politics during that campaign season, I don't know, and I certainly don't think it has worked out well for us.
So in retrospect, was it a mistake?
I actually think in retrospect, yes. Mm-hmm. But I feel, first of all, I always feel badly second guessing public servants. That just seems sort of unfair. They probably know things that I don't know.
That's what you get paid to do.
That's what journalists do,
right.
More or less.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I don't think that it had to have been a mistake. And I'm not sure that it was at all clear at the time it was a mistake, right? It was a mistake is always an interesting question of whether you're, in retrospect, given all the things that has happened, I would argue it was a mistake because it seems to have become so central to how President Trump views himself and his place in history and American rule of law that there are all kinds of bad consequences flowing from it. But, could or should the prosecutors have anticipated that? I did not anticipate that myself, just how vivid and enormous. We did have some indication, I suppose, but I still am not. I think it was I can only say that it's clear to me it was a mistake in retrospect, honestly. And I wish that it hadn't been a mistake, because I don't think the mistake justifies what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now the underlying question is a separation of law and politics. And part of the discussion is the difficulty of separating law and politics, though the necessity of doing so in specific and particular cases. At least as I understand some of what you said earlier, one of the difficulties, what makes for a crisis in this moment, is the targeting of specific and particular individuals. First, can you talk a little bit about that? And then also, if you want to talk about what you found in the survey that you want to bring up.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with the survey because it's a good intro. So we went back to our 50 people, and almost all of them answered the survey again, and then we replaced the missing ones to create again this perfectly 25 Republican appointees, 25 Democratic ones. And their level of alarm at this point is basically off the charts. I mean, we're at a point of 49 of 50. were like absolutely raising the alarm for the rule of law in the United States and the politicization of the Justice Department. And I ran this survey before these the indictments of James Comey and Letitia James started to come down. And when we asked the question of, do you think President Trump is using the Justice Department as a tool of retribution and reward, all 50 people said yes. So even by one outlier on some other things, like it's just very clear. I don't actually think there's like a question about it. And then the other thing that I think is important is that people, when we're essentially equally united in saying that Congress has done little or nothing to prevent or address any of this. Also, I think completely obvious. Sometimes surveys are all about proving the obvious. And then also the role of the Supreme Court, similarly, not quite as unanimous, but almost everyone felt they had also done little or nothing. And the institution in America that our survey respondents felt was pushing back were the lower courts. And I think that's been really significant and important and part of our narrative of this almost first year. Of course, the problem is that the lower courts then answer to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court makes those calls. And so that seems to a lot of our survey respondents like itself a kind of wobbly part of the stool, not through any fault of the lower court judges, but just the institutional prerogatives that they have. So that was the kind of background. And then as I was absorbing these survey results, these indictments start to come down. And there are lots of warning signs going on, right? I mean, part of what the Trump administration does very successfully is just kind of overwhelm us as journalists, as the American public, with lots and lots of things happening that affect the rule of law in America, right? I mean, at some point, I should make sure to mention the executive orders affecting large law firms, which I think have been hugely significant for legal practice. But these indictments really did cross a kind of red line that I think a lot of people, even when they took our survey, didn't really think they would see. And that is, seeing the president call for certain people to be prosecuted, removing Eric Siebert, the U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, a conservative, would have wanted to be a Trump appointee, who was saying, I don't have the facts here to indict James Comey and Letitia James. Like, this is the most bedrock thing that prosecutors do. They go and investigate. Query where there was even a predicate to do these investigations. But I'm going to set that aside. They interviewed witnesses. They looked at documents. They do all the things prosecutors do with the FBI agents, and they said, we don't have a case for an indictment, which is a low standard. We don't want to present this to a grand jury. And Eric Siebert is gone, and Lindsay Halligan, the current person acting as U.S. attorney in Virginia, is an insurance lawyer who's never prosecuted a case before, and she's the one going by herself to present to the grand jury for these indictments. That is a really, since Watergate, an unprecedented set of acts happening, and it doesn't really look like there's an end in sight to it. So then the question becomes, well, how does this whole 100,000 person huge agency respond? How is it affected by this kind of channel that's happening here with these indictments?
Couple follow-ups, but first, what are you hearing from folks who are still there, who have recently resigned? Can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, what I'm mostly hearing is heartbreak. So I probably interviewed 50 people who've either resigned or been fired, and a few people who are still there. And obviously, the people who are choosing to talk to me for this article are people who are in some level of distress, for the most part, not entirely. And I have had person after person say to me, I love my job. I wanted to stay there my whole career. I was a career attorney. I was a public servant. I was nonpartisan. Many, many people. I have worked through many administrations, including the first Trump administration. And I understand that it is my job to carry out the policies of the president, and that to some degree the priorities for law enforcement are going to change. And I was ready for all of that. But this is something else. This is a different thing. This is something that is making me fear for my law license. And even if that particular threat doesn't come to pass, it's wrong. What they were asking me to do is wrong. And so I had to leave, even though I really didn't want to. And the market is terrible, so it's not easy for me to find another job. you know, this is an institution that has been, for people like you, a really pretty terrific place to work in many ways. People who spend their lives as career attorneys at justice, they don't make the same amount of money that partners at big law firms make, but they are representing the United States in both a civil and criminal capacity. They are steady jobs that people could expect to have forever. Some of the work is very, very interesting. They often are close-knit groups in these different sections and divisions of justice. And so there is just an enormous sense of loss going on right now.
I'm going to ask you in a moment about whether you would recommend, what advice would you give to law students, liberal, conservatives, et cetera. But before that, I want to get your thoughts on something that I personally struggle with, which is one response is, especially at a place like HLS, although I think we have a lot more diversity of views than we get credit for. But Dean, is that good? All right. I'm a good follower. Remember that when the teaching schedule comes up. No, but one response is, look, this is it's a polarized world. We all have different views. And this is simply one partisan way of looking at the world, and also not crediting, to go back to, hey, life was not great if you were on the other side under Obama, right, and Biden, right? So it's just a partisan way of looking at the world. And this is more or less partisan alarmism response to a set of events, as opposed to truly crisis or the rule of law being undermined or in question. Especially as a journalist, how do you think and respond and work through that question?
Well, if I was only hearing the alarm from Democrats, or even just from public servants, who, let's be real, in DC tend to be Democrats, then I would take that very seriously and think about it and write about it and make sure to have lots of caveats every time I write. But that's not the case. People who were very high up in the George W. Bush administration are freaked out. People who served in the first Trump administration, mostly off the record, are very freaked out. People who really prevented major problems in the Trump administration are now in a position where they're saying, there aren't going to be lawyers in the room like the lawyers who made that happen, who kind of prevent, the lawyers in the room are not those lawyers anymore. They're not who we were. And the reason was that President Trump concluded from what we did that we were bad lawyers. So one example of this is a kind of, at this point, kind of famous moment, at least in law world, on January 3rd, after the election in 2024. This is the end of the Trump administration. President Trump is really pushing his Justice Department to prosecute, to investigate election fraud, especially in Georgia. And this is to overturn the election results. So Bill Barr, who's been his very loyal, or at least very conservative attorney general, is like, I'm out of here, I'm resigning. That's the end of December. And then there's this cascade, this kind of slow roll crisis in the beginning of January, where Trump is pressuring the remaining top level officials, the acting attorney general and his deputies, to do this fraud investigation into the elections. And they refuse. And they say at this meeting, especially in the Oval Office on January 3rd, no, Mr. President, we will resign if you make us do that. And Trump backed off in that moment. He didn't have the people, and he wasn't emboldened enough to put the people in place to make that happen. That is a hinge moment in American history, I think. When I learned about those meetings a few weeks later, which is when most of us learned about them, the idea that that was going on behind the scenes in this moment when we really weren't sure about the peaceful transfer of power just a few days before January 6th, that really gave me chills. And, if you ask the people who were involved and high up, well, what will happen if this happens again? They kind of laugh and they say there won't be anyone to stop something like that from happening the next time. Those are not partisan Democrats making that point. That is really a kind of the legal profession, the Washington legal establishment putting out a sort of cry for alarm. And so that is my feeling. Look, like I said, surveys often just tell us things we know, but it did really matter to me to hear this from so many Republican as well as Democratic former appointees.
One last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Okay, so assembled group of students, the very best and the brightest. A career at DOJ, as you said, right? A pinnacle career, representing the rule of law, representing the government. The Voting Rights Act was written essentially at the DOJ. What would you advise students, liberal, conservative, middle, come to you in this moment and say, okay, should I go work at the DOJ? How would you think about it in this particular moment?
Well, whenever I give advice to students, if they are crazy enough to ask me about where to go work, I always say to them, you should think about where you're going to learn the most and where you're going to learn things that you want to know that will lead you to the next path in your career, what you want to do, and where can you work for really good people. You know, the Justice Department right now, I think you'd have to be really concerned about what you are going to learn and whether the really good people are still there. Some of this depends on where you're working. You know, if you talk to people, for example, who work on healthcare fraud right now, one part of the civil division, they're pretty happy because that's a priority of the Trump administration and they have more resources and I don't think they've had a lot of people leave and maybe you'd be fine. But there are a lot of other places that are really not fine, in which when you interview people who've left or who are still there and concerned, they are worried that they're being asked to, for example, take declarations from government employees and present them in court when they have reason to think that those declarations are false. That's not something you want to be trying to figure out what you think about as a lawyer. You don't want to be in that position. And I think especially as an up-and-coming person coming into the profession, having the senior people around you wrestling with those decisions and sometimes decided going along with them, that might not be a great place to be to start your career. I will also say, and I have mixed feelings about pointing this out, but there are a lot of U.S. attorneys' offices that are fairly unaffected by what's happening, right? I live in Connecticut. It's easy for me to talk to those folks. They're basically fine. It's kind of business as usual. The question is, how long is that going to continue, right? I mean, we have more than 3 years to go. The number of U.S. attorneys' offices being affected is rising. It's never going to be 93. It probably isn't going to even be the majority of them. But I still think you kind of don't know where the next crisis is going to land. And I think there's just a kind of third question, which is that if you're a student and you're choosing what to do next, especially with your entry-level position, is this the place you want to enter? That's different from, should I leave? Which lots of people are not leaving, and some have really good reasons not to leave. Sometimes it's personal, but there is a lot of, I think, totally good faith wrestling going on in the department. Well, if I leave, is the person who replaced me going to be even worse? Do I have a responsibility to try to stay as long as I can? And also, some people are choosing to stay so they can tell us what's happening, which is, I mean, look, I'm a journalist, so to me that is commendable. Other people think that it's terrible. But whistleblowing within an agency that is in some ways kind of melting down is its own, at least, well, I'm going to say I think it's its own virtue. But that is different from whether you should decide to come as someone at the beginning of your career.
All right, let's open it up for questions.
Thank you. I'm curious.
If you wouldn't mind, please standing up, identify yourself, and then you can ask your question.
I'm Ramsey. I'm a 1L.
Excellent.
I'm curious to know what you think the implications of all this is for a future Democratic administration. Do you think it will embolden them to actually use the Justice Department to advance their agenda and take credit for things, whether it's on civil rights or antitrust or corporate power? Or do you think they'll kind of retreat further into the Biden administration view, which is to be very cautious about any kind of relationship between politics and the DOJ?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So, you know, after Watergate in the 1970s, when President Nixon really misused the Justice Department and his attorney general was involved, and it was Watergate and he had to resign. And so then you see this period of reform. You see the norms that I was talking about before, the separation between the White House and criminal prosecutions and some civil enforcement. And I suppose it's possible that we could have the same kind of, moment of revelation where we have stronger norms than ever. There is going to be an enormous temptation for the next president, the next set of presidents, not to go back to this quasi-independent structure that we had. You know, think about it. Since Nixon, almost every president has been embarrassed in some way by the independence of the Justice Department, right? Iran-Contra, Monica Lewinsky, Whitewater, there's a list. Now, to some degree, this had to do with the Independent Counsel Act that Congress put in place, which was more independent of justice and the Attorney General than the Jack Smith special counsel role, and Congress amended that statute. And so you could argue that I'm talking about a set of problems that don't exist anymore. But really, I mean, you know, Attorney General Garland didn't just appoint Jack Smith, he also appointed special counsels who looked into President Biden's mishandling of classified documents. A US attorney who became a special counsel prosecuted Hunter Biden. So there is this real incentive for future presidents not to do this anymore. Like, if you're that person, who needs this? And I think that that is a real danger and a risk the country is running that is related to, but actually separate from your question, because you were saying, well, what about the kind of democratic priorities about antitrust and civil rights? And I think, yes, we could also expect the president to be more robust about those kinds of shifts. There's going to be a kind of preliminary set of questions that are going to have to do really with people. Are the people who replace all those thousands of people who are leaving, are they going to stay? If they are really different from the people they're replacing, will the next Democratic president fire all of them, fire lots of agency heads? And it really, the way the Supreme Court seems to be moving toward allowing the president to do. And then do we move to a system in which the Justice Department goes back and forth from administration to administration in this way that we have not had since Watergate, and probably we just really never had? And that is a very different kind of Justice Department and federal government than we have had, because instead of having this kind of core of nonpartisan career employees who are experts, who have enormous institutional knowledge, who see themselves as just enforcing laws, you have this kind of partisan action and reaction. And I haven't even gone to the question of whether you prosecute some of the people who are currently doing the prosecutions in the kind of switching back and forth from weaponization to weaponization. I really don't know how all of that is going to play out.
Young man in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. First and foremost, actually, as a young man, I just want to say what a fanboy I am of you, Emily. Thank you for all the years of incredibly articulate, fair, and concrete reporting on our legal system. It has never been more important than it is today, as on display here. So thanks for sharing that with us. I guess my question really builds exactly on where you said, which is whether we need some kind of structural reform of the Justice Department in order to prevent what you see as, I think, quite rightly, a predictable back and forth shift that we could get. That is whether one based on norms and not formal separation is enough. And if you agree with that, as many other countries do, I wonder how you think we might, forgetting for the moment the political realities of whether you could ever actually do this, what might be a better system to protect the things you want to protect?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great set of questions, and I wish I could present a solution that even I feel confident in. So as I'm sure a lot of you know, the kind of basic problem here is that the Attorney General works for the President of the United States. And it is pretty hard to think like how we would change that. Are we going to independently elect the Attorney General? Now, I mean, states do this. States have attorneys general who are not, hired and fired by the governor, and the voters elect them. But the idea that you would have the chief federal law enforcement of the country as a separately elected office with all of the power that brings, that's a really unusual constitutional structure, and it makes me nervous. On the other hand, I don't think that relying on norms seems to be working anymore. So then I'm kind of torn. Professor Charles and I were talking about this earlier. One could argue that what has gone wrong for us is that we have a president who just doesn't operate in good faith, who is pushing all these boundaries instead of really trying to respect them and see himself as a steward of the rule of law and the Justice Department and kind of treasure its independence. And as long as we elect people who see the value of that independence, we can go back to norms and it will all kind of be okay. The problem, I think, goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that once you make the system be so out of whack, bringing it back into line seems really tricky. And so this is going to sound a little pie in the sky right now, but I really feel like Congress needs to think hard about this and whether there is some way to have more codifications, more statutory protections for the Justice Department's independence than we currently have. You know, some of the things in the Justice Manual wouldn't easily translate into statute. They really are more rules. You know, when you talk about preventing certain forms of communication, for example, between the White House and the Justice Department, can you really have the legislature come in and mandate that? Will the Supreme Court say that that is, an infringement on the president's Article 2 powers? I'm not sure, but I really hope the Congress tries. And that is imagining, obviously, a different Congress than the one we have now.
The amazing Dean Minow.
You didn't say young.
He meant it. He meant it, Martha.
I used that line already.
No, Professor Wilkins is young. The line that you're exploring goes to the core of the mission of this institution. Is there something that is law that is not politics? And I don't have an answer to that. So I'm going to shift the conversation to your comments about leaks, which some people would call whistleblowing. Mm-hmm. What's the line there? And who's willing to talk to you? And are people willing to talk to you who weren't willing before? And are people willing to talk to you or not willing to talk to you who were before? And with what's going on with the Pentagon and the journalists there, what are the prospects for journalism right now?
Well, thank you so much for that question. I have known Dean Minow my whole life, and it's really amazing to get to even take a question from you in a room like this. So thank you for being here. First of all, I am so heartened by the solidarity of the journalists at the Pentagon because that has been almost universal. Fox News, Newsmax, they are standing there with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. Almost everyone turned their press cards in because the Pentagon's requests were just to ask us to stop doing our jobs with the most basic idea of how we do our jobs. So that to me has actually been quite heartening. It's not easy for journalists to have any solidarity. We're very fractious and we're meant to compete with each other. So that yes, that was a good sign. I think, look, of course I'm pro-leaking. I understand that institutions can't have everyone leaking all the time. The New York Times has rules about leaking. So I don't mean to sound, wholly craven about it. But when things are going wrong inside an institution, people need to tell what's happening. And it is especially striking to me, some people have had what I would call a kind of noisy withdrawal. I'm misusing that term, as you probably all know. But they have resigned noisily. They have written letters. Maybe they haven't gone on television. That's tricky. I understand why a lot of people don't want to do that or even why they don't want to talk directly to the press. But those statements that people have made where they've really explained why the demands of the administration were not at odds with their own professional responsibilities and ethics have been important. So, for example, Danielle Sassoon, Scalia clerk, former acting US attorney for the Southern District of New York, one of the most powerful offices in the country. She gets asked to dismiss the Eric Adams charges. She thinks that that is at odds with law and her job as the acting US attorney. And she writes a long letter with a lot of quotes from Justice Scalia about why this is the wrong thing to do. And I think that was commendable and important. Leaking, of course, can be different because it can happen more in secret while you're not necessarily putting your name out there. There are people talking to us from inside the department who would 150% not just be fired if you knew who they were, if the administration knew, but also could expect a level of being bullied and threatened and harassed in real life as well as on social media that just didn't exist before. So I can't really blame them either. It is very hard from going to being someone who no one knew who your name was and you were happy with that, to being a public figure because you criticized President Trump. You can lose control of that narrative very, very quickly. So people like Erez Raveni, who felt that his duty of candor in court was being interfered with and became a federal whistleblower and now are speaking out, I have a lot of respect for, but not everybody wants to play that role. In terms of people talking to us, and I'll really just speak for myself here as a reporter, a year ago when I did my first survey, it was not that hard to get people to talk on the record. Both prominent and prominent Democratic appointees, it was, people had some sense, sure, they're law firms, but I got a lot of people talking on the record. This time, a lot of people, no. People did not want to talk on the record. Some of it was fear of retaliation, especially people whose family members still work for the Justice Department, and that was a real fear. I mean, Maureen Comey, who's James Comey's daughter, was fired. His son-in-law, who worked in the Eastern District of Virginia as an assistant U.S. attorney, resigned. Like, these are real issues. So again, I'm hesitant to judge people. But another thing is going on with the big law firms, which is that the executive orders that targeted those firms, so I think we're at like 10 or so firms. As you all, I'm sure know, some firms settled and some firms sued. And now I'm actually really quoting Peter Keisler, who is an on-the-record source of mine and lots of people, he was the acting attorney general for George W. Bush, and he has come out of retirement to both litigate and be a voice at this moment. And what Peter was saying over the weekend at Yale Law School, where we were having alumni weekend, was that the firms that settled, the firms that sued, they're basically all fine. The firms that sued are having like a really nice pride morale moment, and the firms that settled have lost some senior partners, which hasn't been great. But business-wise, everyone is okay. The real impact, in Peter's view, is everybody else. Because when you look at the number of big law firms that want to be on an amicus brief, for example, in the birthright citizenship case, very, very small. And then, you have a question, okay, well, that is a sign, and you go back and you look at the travel ban cases where you had like 50 big firms challenging the administration, and that's bad to have that, to see that chilling effect. But what is also really apparent is that the big firms are not doing direct representation of people having immigration violations, of people who've been fired, of people who are challenging the administration in a myriad of ways. And that means that the kind of very basic tenet of the legal profession, that everyone deserves a lawyer, and hopefully a good lawyer, is at risk because of a sense of political fear and intimidation. And I really, really worry about that. And now I'm going to say for our profession, even though I never hold myself out as a lawyer because I didn't practice, but I have enough instilled in me from law school of a sense of being part of a profession where that is such a proud tradition. And it is at risk right now. And it is at risk, I would say, largely because of money, right? I mean, that's really what is at issue here. And yes, people build businesses and they invest in them, and I understand the importance of that. But it has been dismaying to me to see how much chilling there is from these executive orders, which of course, when people have sued, the district courts have ruled in their favor. But that is really only a small part of all the factors that are weighing on these law firms that have really changed the role that they're playing in American political and legal life right now.
We're going to take one last quick question, quick answer, before we send the great Emily Bazelon back to New Haven.
Emily was my student. I have more to say than that, but in any event, what more can the courts do? We've talked about this. The courts have been thunderous in their rejection of unconstitutional policies. After the 60 Minutes program yesterday, when Ryan Goodman talked about the numbers of times that DOJ lawyers have lied in court, there's a presentation on just security. What is the next step other than the thunderous decision? Can courts be holding officials of the government in contempt? Judge Boasberg must have spoken about that this weekend. It's very difficult to imagine.
Judge Boasberg barely spoke about that this weekend.
Give us something hopeful to hang our hat on.
Well, look, I mean, I think the lower court judges have to just keep doing their jobs. They have to keep their head down, look at each case that comes in front of them, say honestly what is happening before them and what they see. And when they use strong language, sometimes that's really important because it helps people like me see what's happening. A month or two ago, we put together just like list of the kinds of quotes that are coming from district and appellate court judges around the country in response to the kind of conduct and arguments they're seeing before them on the bench. And I think that was like a really powerful vehicle, which exists because of the judges. And they have life tenure. And my sense from having done a bunch of reporting, talking to lots of judges last spring and summer, is that a lot of them feel like this is what they're here for. It is not pleasant to have, the president or his top officials rip into you and call you a far left radical or call for your impeachment. They're not excited about that. But they're also like really uncowed. I have this one conversation that is in my head of someone who retired from the bench fairly recently. He was a Republican appointee, and he said, "I can't believe I left. Like, this is what I should be living for." And I'm so, he's at a major law firm, and he said, "That is not where I want to be right now. I don't want to be silenced and chilled. I want to be back on the bench doing what they're doing because that's the job." Now, I'll also say, and Judge Gertner may disagree with me, I think it's also really important for judges to not overreact, right? To be very careful, to just, and I don't mean careful in like a cowed, punctilious way. I just mean to think hard about what their role is in the democracy and to play their role. Having the other branches distort their own conduct in response to Trump is, I think, not helpful. And the American public right now sees the judiciary, for better or for worse, I mean rightly or wrongly, as very politicized. And so I think it's important for judges to continue to make sure that they are judging the case in front of them, that they're clear about the evidence, and mostly I think they need to be giving really good explanations and fact-finding for what they're doing. And that is something that has been, of course, very much lacking on the emergency/shadow/interim docket from the Supreme Court, which to me has been one of the biggest problems from the point of view of the judiciary, is the lack of explanation. This is really where I think judges get a lot of their legitimacy from, is explaining what they are doing and what their reasons are. And so some of my most heartening moments have been reading opinions from judges where it's just very clear what they are doing. Judge Immergut in Portland, a Trump appointee, explaining why she doesn't think that the president has the power to federalize the National Guard in Oregon. Really clear explanation. You can disagree, but you can see what her reasoning was. And so I think that has been just a crucial role that the district and appellate court judges have been playing, and I hope and expect them to continue playing that as long and as much as they can.
All right, perfect place to leave it. Emily Bazelon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.